Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of Inside with IAIS. My name is Gabe. Today we're going to talk a little bit about language. Do you know what Connecticut, Manhattan, and Massachusetts have all in common? You might say a few things, but did you all know that they're place names for Native Americans? They specifically come from the language of Algonquian, which was, and in some cases still is, spoken by tribes throughout the Northeast. Language tells us a lot about different things. It helps us to communicate, it helps us to name places, and it helps us to tell stories. It also tells a little bit about culture and their values. For instance, in Algonquian, there was no language or word in the language for land ownership traditionally. For Native people, Algonquian-speaking tribes, they didn't believe that you could own land. You would use the land, you cared for the land, you were supposed to help protect the land, you moved around on the land. It was considered a gift from the Creator that you were supposed to care for, but you didn't own the land. So language is very important to people for many different reasons. So as you can see, Connecticut was the original name for Connecticut. It is an Algonquian word, and it translates to the place of long water. You might also sometimes see it as place of the long tidal river, but it tells you where the name for our state comes from. So as I mentioned, language is very important because it helps us to communicate not only our stories, but also our values. So one way that I'm going to illustrate that is with a talk about wampum. So you may have heard of wampum before. Wampum is an Algonquian term, and it actually means white bead. And it had a lot of importance in Native traditions, and still is important to this very day. Originally, you would spend a lot of time making wampum beads using stone pump drills. You put a lot of time and effort and care into making those beads. You would make them out of the quahog, most often, the quahog, which is another Algonquian word. And because you put a lot of time and effort into that, it was really a symbol of honor. It was a way of saying thanks to somebody, if you wanted to say thank you. It was a bond between different people. If you wanted to show that you were trustworthy, you might give somebody some wampum. It had really a lot of value for social and spiritual reasons. When Europeans arrived, first the Dutch in this area about 450 years ago, they saw Native people using wampum as exchange. And because of their culture, their language, their associations, they thought of it a lot like money. So if you've ever heard of that association of wampum being like Indian money, it really came from Europeans, specifically the Dutch, not so much from Native people. For them, it was actually a lot more valuable than money. In fact, sometimes you'll see what are called wampum belts. These strands of wampum beads that are woven together into a belt. This is actually a replica of one of the more famous wampum belts. When you see these different colors and designs in the belts, it's not just for decoration. Oftentimes there are stories or histories or even treaties. This is one of the most famous wampum belts, the Hiawatha belt. And it tells a history of the Iroquois or Haudenosaunee, people of the Long Houses, and how their confederacy came together. So a long time ago, there was conflict between the different tribes in the Iroquois nations. The great peacemaker brought them together. It was the Seneca were the western door, the Mohawk were the eastern door, the Oneida and the Cayuga, and then in the center, which is also representing the great pine tree, is the Onondaga tribe. So they came together to form this confederacy. There was a time of peace. And this confederacy is still alive to this day. It is the oldest living democracy, and it is one that the founding fathers of the United States used as one of the models for the US Constitution. So it's still a very important story and history to this very day. So while people tell stories using language, the artifacts in our museums also tell stories. But of course, they don't actually have a voice, so they can't speak for themselves. So it's up to our museum to tell the stories of our artifacts. And these stories sometimes are very important. Let's start with this artifact. As you might know, this is an axe. Do you know what material it's made from? If you look really closely, you can see that it's actually a stone axe. Now, how are you going to cut down a tree with a stone axe? If you didn't know the full story, you might not even think that it was possible. But this is where the story comes in. Native people would start by peeling off the bark at the base of the tree. Then they'd light a fire. The fire would burn the base of the tree, and then you would really just need a heavy tool to finish the job. If you wanted to control the fire, you'd use a bit of clay so you didn't burn the entire tree. Say that you wanted to make a canoe, a dugout canoe, or a mashoon. Once you cut down the tree, you could use something called an adze in order to scrape it out. Again, you might ask how you do that if you just saw this artifact by itself. But as you can see, what they do is they light a fire on top of that log, and they gradually burn out the inside of that log and scrape away. You're not scraping away at the hard wood, you're actually scraping away at the charcoal. So it might take a little bit of time, but it's not as physically demanding as you might think. And they could make actually quite large dugout canoes this way. And they might preserve them in the winter by submerging them in lakes. They have found dugout canoes in this state, one specifically up in Highland Lake in Winstead, Connecticut. So now you know the story of this axe, but why is that important? Let me tell you a little bit of a story. So our education coordinator, Darlene Kassak, who you might have been listening Tales from the Rabbit Bag to recently, when her son was younger and she brought him to a museum, she saw they saw axe heads on display with no other description or explanation. So her son actually said that he felt a little bit disappointed in his ancestors because he didn't know that full story of how that axe was actually used. So telling those stories accurately gives you a completely different picture of Native people than if you just saw axe heads without any other explanation or any other way of displaying them that gives that complete story. So now you have heard some stories, but why are these stories important? We at our museum cover more than 10,000 years of history. Native American history and culture is oftentimes misunderstood. And sometimes people actually forget that Native people are still alive, even though they might not live the same way that their ancestors did. So it's your turn now. We want you to share some stories from your culture or your life. What is an object that you use in everyday life? Why do you find it important? And what's the story behind it? Why is it important to you? And might people not understand it correctly if you weren't there to tell that story? So you could either comment below this video or message us on Facebook, but we'd like to hear your stories as well. Thank you.